Welcome to EPG Parshala. I am Professor B. Hariharan from the Institute of English, University of Kerala. The paper is titled 20th Century English Literature, and the module we are looking at now is William Golding's novel Lord of the Flies. Let's begin. Let's begin with an introduction. William Golding received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1983. There are 5 major works by William Golding, which include Lord of the Flies, which was first published in 1954, The Inheritors in 1955, Pincher Martin in 1956, Darkness Visible in 1979, and Close Quarters 1987. There are other novels by William Golding which the student could look at and understand more about William Golding. The novel under consideration focuses primarily on the depravity of human nature. Now, this novel has a very disturbing theme as it tries to analyze a deeper reality about the way in which we all behave, we all think, we all act. Lord of the Flies is considered to be his masterpiece. Now, this is a novel that speaks to us today, as it is an analysis of the human potential for savagery. Now, why is it that we say that this novel speaks to us today? We need to keep in mind that this is a novel that was written in the 20th century at the midpoint after the Second World War, and when we read the novel today, we clearly do understand we are forced to go back to the trauma and the horror of the 2 world wars, and also the capability that human beings have to inflict pain and suffering, no matter how civilized we are. Now, this is probably the singular reason why this book talks to us in the 21st century. Now, the way in which it does this is equally interesting. The novel takes up the popular stereotype of the innocent child. Children, we believe, or we know, or we assume that are always innocent. Now, it is this idea that's taken up to talk about something very, very fundamental about the way in which we relate to one another. What William Golding does here is to write a dystopian novel. It projects a dystopian vision of the world, as it were, and because of this, perhaps, the novel did create a great deal of controversy. Now, what the book also does in the process is to examine certain basic or cardinal motives governing human conscience. Man is a noble savage, is something that we have all heard. Now, we also have heard and believe very much that we are very civilized, that we are very different from animals. That's because we have this capacity to reason things out. Perhaps at some level, what we have here in this idea is a very romantic notion of the human being, of the race itself. Now, this is not the only novel where Golding tries to talk about human beings and what they are capable of doing. There is another novel where he tries to trace the evolution of the species, the inheritors. To come back to this novel, what Lord of the Flies does is to dispute the romantic ideal of human nobility in the face of adversity. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation. Now, how did we start thinking that we are a noble species? Part of this goes to the faith that we have, that we are evolved and we are creatures of the intellect. This, in a way, is a romantic ideal that we have, and this is something that is disputed in this novel. The novel works at more than one level. It can be seen as a straight narrative, it can be seen as an allegory, it can be seen as a parable, it can be seen as a dystopia. At the same time, even as it does all this, it also perhaps tries to underscore or draw attention to a world of innocence that somehow has been turned upside down. You have an island where there are a lot of young boys who are marooned, who are caught there. This is the story in a nutshell. And there is this fight for leadership, for power. There is murder. And in the process, what happens is that the novel seems to project the inherent sadism in these boys who are in their teens, many of them. Now, what it indicates then, it hints then, is that human beings are innately very, very cruel. The sadistic nature of these boys, these characters in the novel, seem to indicate this cruelty. Now, this does not mean that Golding is portraying a world where children are cruel. They stand for the children, and what they do stands for something else. So there is another level at which this novel seems to be operating. Now, what the novel also does is to question, to interrogate certain concepts like individual will versus and herd mentality, morality and savagery, nature, nurture, the will to dominate, the urge to follow. In other words, we are talking here about the ways in which this book is trying to draw attention to a binary that seems to control the way in which we have shaped ourselves and shaped our thinking and the way in which we relate to others. This book is a very fine example of an allegory. There are different kinds of allegory. Now, there could be a political allegory, there could be a social allegory. Now, allegory is a literary device used to convey a secondary level of signification. There is, in other words, the primary meaning, the surface meaning that you have, signification that you have, and you read that, you get it, and when you look at it a little more carefully, you see that it's talking to you at a very different level altogether. This is what we would generally like to identify as the secondary level. So it's a literary device primarily. There are a number of allegories, for example. I will give you one example. Think of a poem that we all, let's say, have heard of or are familiar with to some extent. A poem like Fairy Queen by Sir Edmund Spenser. No, Fairy Queen is an allegory. It's an allegory, it's a poem. On the surface, when you read it, you would say is about the Fairy Queen. It would talk about the exploits of a knight. You would have all the staples of chivalry, of romance, of valor, everything. So it can read perhaps like an adventure of heroism, but then when you look at it a little bit more carefully, you would find that this is a poem that seems to be talking not just about a knight and the Fairy Queen there, but it seems to be talking about Queen Elizabeth I, Gloriana in the poem. So this is an example of an allegory. This is a very familiar example in English literature. Now if we take the same example and then start to try and understand what an allegory is all about, we can identify the two levels, the primary level and the secondary level. The primary level of signification is literal. It's the literal meaning that you get. But at the secondary level, the meaning that you get is often symbolic. So now to return to the novel, at the primary level, you might say that this is the story of a group of boys who are marooned on this island, and it's their life and their adventures. But then at the symbolic level, it's talking to you about the way in which adults behave. Now, what an allegory also does is to project the author's moral or political perspective in a veiled manner. It's hinted, it's very subtly hinted, it's suggested, you might even say. It's the veiling that's very important. Now, the power that an allegory has is derived, or it derives its power in the way in which this political or moral or social perspective that the author has. Now, how that perspective is concealed or veiled, what are the ways in which it is done? Fine. Now, there is one other thing that happens in an allegory, and that has to do with the characters. When we read, let's say, a Shakespeare poem, when we read a play, characters are characters. We would talk about the way in which characters evolve, they develop or they grow or they change. But in an allegory, characters are, or they very often become, personifications, in the sense that they stand for something, for certain values, or they could stand for certain ideas, concepts, etc. Now, when we get a text like this, I think it's very important to locate the text against its background. Now, we did that by drawing attention to the two world wars and the year of composition of the novel and its publication. Now, the background to this novel is very, very important. The background is set against war, and what it signifies, what it indicates, is a world of horror destruction, deceit, I think it's possible to add a lot more to it. When the boys are marooned on this island, it starts off as a very idyllic kind of a place. It's almost like the Garden of Eden. Now, what happens is, gradually, this whole place with the children in it metamorphoses into a very dark, sinister place. Now, this is a very interesting theme that runs throughout this book. This idea of transformation is a thread that is worked in a very, very interesting manner in this novel. Now, this novel also seems to build on a number of contrasts. Now, the most obvious contrast has to do with the Edenic versus the sinister, and then the idyllic natural setting contrasted with action. So you have place which is very idyllic, and then you have the action of the boys, which is essentially very, very brutal. So you have an idyllic place, and then you have the actions that are perpetrated there, which do not tie up, do not synchronize with the place. Now, this is what gives the novel its ironic punch, if one might say so. Now, the idyllic, the Edenic place then eventually becomes a harsh and unforgiving kind of a setting, right? So I think we need to be very conscious of this relationship between the setting and the action. Now, this takes us to this idea that the island becomes or is a microcosm of the whole of the outside world, or the whole world, or the world in which we live in. Now, the characters that you have in the novel, we will list them later on. These characters do not grow, we had said earlier. These characters become symbols in the sense that they stand for something. They stand for something. Ralph is a boy, is one character in this book. Ralph symbolizes order and harmony. He stands for fair play, tries to sustain communal harmony. In other words, he is an idealist. Human beings, we are all human beings, and we all have our instincts. Our instincts, whatever sophistication we have, our instincts do not change. Now, Ralph somehow seems not to understand the basic or the baser instincts of other boys. We try to channel our instincts, but then there are certain instincts perhaps that get the better of us. So there are these baser instincts which Ralph doesn't seem to recognize or even understand. And it's in this sense that he is an idealist. So you have Ralph, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have Jack. Jack represents the destructive principle. He symbolizes the innate savagery in human beings. Now, there is a word for this innate savagery in human beings. The things that we are capable of thinking, capable of doing. And that word is atavism. I am sure you would have come across this word atavism or atavistic tendencies when you read a book like Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Jack in this novel is on a megalomaniacal quest for power. So you have Ralph, who has this democratic impulse, and Jack, who has this megalomaniacal impulse and wants to consolidate power. So what Jack does is to oust Ralph and demonstrate the victory of savagery over fair play. This is the paradigm that you have. In for this paradigm, let's say, to be complete, you also have a savior figure in the narrative, and that is Simon. So Simon is the savior figure in the narrative. Now this must be a very familiar structure for us. Now we are now talking about a democratic impulse and a megalomaniacal impulse. There's a savior, but then that does not complete this picture. Any society, if you look at any society, a society will have intellectuals. Who is the intellectual in this novel? There is an intellectual in this novel who is very pragmatic, and he is Piggy. There is a young boy. There's a boy called Roger. Roger is an embodiment of the most malevolent aspects of human nature, not the benevolent. Here is a boy who loves to see how blood is spilled. Now, there are two boys, Sam and Derek, who are representative of the crowd mentality with which I suppose we all are familiar. Think of how a crowd would behave, a group of people would behave. So Sam and Derek are representatives of the crowd mentality. And there are little boys, very young children. Who are they? They are the masses who would prefer to be led rather than become leaders. In other words, what the novel does is to hold a mirror to the modern war-ravaged world. Now, this is the allegorical dimension. Now, let us look at the biblical allusions, references that you have in the novel. The indications, I think, are all there if you've been looking at this text a little carefully. There is this unnamed island. You might say that it is an archetype of the biblical Eden, the Garden of Eden. The boys, when you see them, initially are very innocent. They are in a state that is comparable to that of Adam and Eve before their fall from grace. Lord of the Flies represents perhaps the serpent in Eden, the tempter. Now, this might appear too neat, but this is one of the issues that one needs to be thinking about when we read an allegorical narrative. There is a pig, the head of a pig on a stick, which is erected. Now, that is a very, very disturbing kind of an image, and it has been read as an external manifestation of man's innate, the inherent bestiality in us. So this gives you the biblical dimension in the story. Now, try to think about the biblical narrative. Eden in the Genesis story was corrupted. Now, in the novel, Eden is corrupted by man's innate evil. Now, this is very different from what you have in the biblical narrative. So, here the corruption is because of whatever is there within us, unlike what you have in the biblical narrative. Because in the biblical narrative, you have somebody else intruding or coming in, Satan coming in the form of a serpent. Now, in this novel, Simon becomes the Christ figure, and we all know what happened to Jesus Christ. Simon is compassionate and introspective, and he is one, as it were, one almost with nature. He is the only boy. He is the only boy in the novel who realizes the truth about the Lord of the Flies. His encounter with the beast is symbolic of Christ's conversation with the devil. Now, unlike Christ, Christ is the Savior. That's what Christianity tells you. Unlike that, here Simon is a defeated Savior because he is unable to help the boys. Now, even the title of the novel, The Lord of the Flies, has biblical references, echoes. Now, the title of the novel, Lord of the Flies, alludes to Beelzebub. Now, Ralph's sorrow for the end of innocence, because there's so much of violence and bloodshed in this novel. Ralph's sorrow for the end of innocence echoes this primordial wail of biblical man, the way in which we all yearn for, cry for his lost innocence and lost Eden. Now we'll come to the third aspect that can be addressed in this novel, and that is intertextuality. Intertextuality refers to the multiple ways in which a text's meaning is influenced by many other texts and authors. Now, if you look at this thing a little carefully, you will understand that almost all texts do have an intertextual level, because no text can be created in isolation. Texts always are related to one another. Intertexts stand in relation to one another. This is a concept, this is an idea that has been taken up for discussion. You will find this in many of the texts that you study in your 20th century English literature course, and this is no different. There are many terms, many ideas that are associated with intertextuality. Allusion is one example. When we study our plays, when we think of Fairy Queen, it would allude to, look at the sentences that we write, it would allude to something. So, allusions, quotations. We would quote, a text will quote another text. This happens always. Pastiche, parody. Parody, I suppose, requires no explanation. We all know what parody is. These are, let me repeat, allusions, quotations, pastiche and parody. These are concepts, ideas that are always associated with intertextuality. This is a novel which has a number of intertextual elements. The narrative here is in great contrast compared to other novels like R.M. Ballantyne's Coral Island or Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which is something that young children love to read, or Swallows and Amazons. So this is a novel that seems to be in contrast, stark contrast, when you compare it to some of these novels. Now, this is a book that is taken to be, that is read as an intertext of R.M. Ballantyne's The Coral Island. That's the book where again you have an island, and then you have, it's a story of adventure. Like the Treasure Island, that's also a story of adventure. Now, all these narratives that we mention here, they all are very straight narratives, but then when you read a book like The Lord of the Flies, you feel that these other adventure stories are somehow naive when you place it alongside Golding's savage narrative. This is a savage saga. There is no other way in which you can talk about it. Now, to point out this specific intertextual element here, it is useful to note that there are two characters from Ballantyne's novel Coral Island whose names are retained in this novel, and they are Ralph and Jack. Ballantyne's, now this is what Golding has done. Ballantyne's Jack is a gentleman, he is an absolute gentleman. But see what Golding does. He has his Jack unleash all the power of evil. Now, what Golding does in the process is to create a dystopia, and in the process offer or show how Ballantyne's narrative world is implausibly optimistic, that it is not possible to be optimistic like this, because again, as I pointed out earlier, we all have that atavistic tendency. It is waiting to come out, no matter however civilized we are, in some form or the other. Given the right moment, it will come. We cannot suppress it. Now, this is a very, very chilling thing to say. This might be a little difficult to accept, but it's a fact. Now, let's look at the major themes and motifs and symbols of the book. We will list them out, and they all will be, I would say, related to much of the things that we have been trying to share. The first thing, of course, is the innate savagery of man. Now, this is a very important theme in this book, savagery of man. And then, Lord of the Flies, we said, is Beelzebub. That was the biblical dimension. That can be understood as the representation or even the manifestation outside of the evil that is within. The novel stands or seems to talk to us about the symbols of civilization. What are the symbols that we have created that say that we are a civilized people? Think, for example, of all these stories that we have. Think of the narratives that we tell. Think of the way in which we tell each other that we are civilized. What are the indicators that say that we are civilized? So, and we have seen that there are a number of symbols. We have seen some of them. Fine. Now we will take one by one. The innate savagery of man. What is that? The novel contrasts man's savage instincts and the refinements imposed by nature. What we would, in other words, refer to this as, we would refer to this then as the binary between nature and nurture, if you want, order and disorder. Now Ralph, Piggy, Simon, they all stand, or they all are embodiments of order, whereas Jack and Roger represent man's primal urges. Now one starts suspecting whether they are really all that bad, Jack and Roger, because if they represent man's primal urges, then can we really say that they are evil? Because we are talking here about something that is within all of us. There are questions then that this text asks about morality, human morality, this capability to do good or bad. Human morality in this novel then is presented as something that is constructed. There is also this dichotomy, as it were, between instinct and reason. There is this instinct for evil, to do something, which overpowers this choice of the voice, rather, the choice and even voice of reason. So this is the world that we have. What about the evil within? How is evil formed? How is this thought, this idea formed in the human psyche? Is it an archetype? How is it? Is it there in the collective unconscious? How is it? Now, the book seems to indicate that our inherent affinity for evil is not supernatural. It's not supernatural. The myth of the beast is very carefully cultivated. We would say that a snake, for example, is evil because it's poisonous. We would say that the jackal is a beast. Everything around us are beasts. The only species in the world that is not a beast is a human being. This is the way in which we create the myth of the beast. So in the process, what happens is we disguise the violence and whatever that's hidden in us. So this is very carefully orchestrated. So what Golding is doing here is to examine the social evolution of evil, because the boys that we see in the novel are the products of the modern world. Look at the symbols that we have. We will identify at least 3 or 4 symbols here. The conch is a symbol here. The conch, critics point out, the conch shell represents the spirit of democracy. One just needs to think about that for a moment. The conch produces pure, unadulterated sound when you blow into it. It's pure. And that's the spirit of democracy. There's nothing that prevents the air from flowing, and that's why you hear the sound. And that's why it is considered to be the spirit of democracy. It's not stifled. The signal fire, representing the values, representing the values represented by civilization. Think about that. Think about the purity. Think about values that we think we should all uphold as members of a civilized race, a species. Piggy wears glasses. His glasses represent rational thinking, spirit of inquiry, scientific spirit. Now, this is at the novelistic, at the level of the novel. This is how it works. Now, let's conclude some of the. We'll try to cull out the major ideas in this novel. Fear is a very important motive that guides and shapes the narrative. And this is the way in which this book leaves its impact in you. The island descends into a state of paranoia. We just need to look at the world around us today to understand what the novel is trying to tell us. And this is where we can really understand what's happening on that island. The world of these boys, what kind of world is this? It's an anarchic world. Do they believe in words? What are words for them? Words are meaningless for them because they concentrate a lot on action, physical action. What the novel, I would say, ultimately kind of underscores is a very different kind of language. And I think this is probably the reason why this novel got the Nobel Prize. And I think this emphasis on this language of fear is what really leaves you. This is that feeling that lingers with you as you finish reading this novel. I hope you will enjoy reading the novel. Thank you.